For 7 years, the bull never fought back, not once. He took every lash, every blow with silence. Until one morning, something changed. He didn't move away. He didn't flinch. He just stared, eyes locked on the man who had broken him. And in that moment, the silence became something else, something terrifying. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and like the video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's jump into the story. The sound of the whip cracked through the morning air like lightning splitting a calm sky. Then came the bull's cry, low, deep, and filled with pain. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong on a peaceful ranch morning. But on the Madsen farm, it had become as familiar as the rooster's crow. Elroy Madsen stood in the middle of the dusty pen, his eyes hard and cold. His weathered hand held the long leather whip like an old friend. Before him stood Bruno, a bull as black as storm clouds and twice as heavy, with shoulders built like stone. Once, Bruno had been proud, strong, energetic, and full of fire. Now, after 7 long years under Elroy's hand, he stood still and silent, his back covered with scars that told a quiet story of pain. "Move, you stubborn slab of muscle," Elroy growled, stepping closer. His face twisted into a bitter grin as he raised the whip again. I said move. But Bruno didn't move. He simply stood there, his head slightly lowered, his massive body tense. His eyes didn't blink. They were fixed on Elroy, calm and dark, watchful. From the fence, Nate Madsen, Elroy's 23-year-old son, winced. "Dad," he called out, his voice tight with worry. "He's bleeding again. Maybe that's enough for today." Elroy turned sharply, his gray eyes narrowing. "Don't you start," he snapped. "You want to run this place or pet animals? At the county fair? This bull listens to me or he gets the whip, end of story." Nate said nothing. He clenched the wood rail until his knuckles turned white, his stomach tight with guilt. This wasn't the first time he'd tried to speak up, and like all the other times, it ended with his father's voice shouting him down. Bruno hadn't always been called Bruno. Back when he arrived on the ranch, Elroy had simply called him the Black One. No name, just another beast to be tamed. But over time, the ranch hands had started calling him Bruno quietly, behind Elroy's back. Somehow it felt like the bull deserved something more than thing or beast. But even the ranch hands had started to keep their distance. They'd seen too many lashes, too many bruises, too many quiet moments when the bull would stand and stare with something far too human in his eyes. Bruno had grown massive in those years, nearly 2,000 pounds of muscle, silent rage, and memory. He didn't buck, didn't thrash, didn't fight. But he watched. Every strike, every cruel word, every long night without food. He remembered. Back at the house, Elroy's reputation had spread through the town like dust in the wind. People whispered in the diner. They said he'd gone too far, that he wasn't training his animals anymore, he was torturing them. Even Dr. Wyatt Keene, the old vet who'd served every farm in 3 counties, had stopped visiting unless there was no choice. But Elroy didn't care. "They've all gone soft," he'd bark to anyone who'd listen. "These days they treat cows like house pets. Not me. I run a real ranch." The truth, though, was uglier than his words. The Madsen ranch was falling apart. The cows were stressed, the calves weren't healthy, and several animals had died from what Elroy called bad luck. But the whispers in town said otherwise, and at the center of it all was Bruno, the bull that should have been the ranch's future. Once meant for breeding and strength, he had become the bruised shadow of what he once was. As the sun climbed, higher over the fields, Elroy coiled the whip and spat in the dust. "Same time tomorrow, you ugly brute," he muttered as he walked away. "Maybe you'll finally listen." Bruno stayed motionless even after Elroy was gone. He stared toward the farmhouse, his breath slow but heavy, his eyes dark but focused. The other cattle in the nearby pastures stayed far from the pen, as if they could feel something deep inside Bruno shifting. Nate didn't move either. He remained by the fence long after his father had disappeared into the house. He watched Bruno the way one might watch a sleeping storm. Growing up, Nate had thought his father was tough, but fair. As he got older, he started to see the cracks in that belief. Now those cracks were deep as canyons. He knew what he'd witnessed wasn't control. It was cruelty. And Nate was starting to wonder how long any living creature could take it. Bruno was breathing steadily now. His eyes were half closed, but his ears still twitched with every sound. His hooves dug lightly into the dirt beneath him. Not in fear, in memory. There's a line, Nate thought. Even the quietest creatures can be pushed past it. And from the way Bruno's muscles tensed just under his skin, the way his eyes didn't leave the farmhouse window, it was starting to feel like that line had been crossed. The next few weeks on the Madsen ranch felt heavier than usual, like the land itself was holding its breath. Elroy's routine didn't change. Each morning he walked out to the pen with the same stiff steps, his whip coiled and ready. And each morning Bruno stood in the same spot, silent and still, but not like before. Something about the bull had shifted. He wasn't flinching anymore. He wasn't shrinking back or turning his head. He simply stared, right at Elroy. Not with fear, not even with rage, just with deep, unblinking focus. His eyes followed Elroy's every movement. It was as if the bull was waiting, watching, studying. At first, Elroy scoffed at the change. "Look at him," he muttered to the ranch hands one morning, finally learning who's in charge. But the others weren't so sure. The tension around the corral had grown so thick you could almost feel it in the air. The other cattle kept their distance. The ranch dogs refused to go near the fence, and the hands, most of them kept to the barn or fields unless they absolutely had to approach. Even Nate noticed something new in Bruno. He didn't seem broken anymore. He seemed calm. Too calm. Like a pond that looked still on the surface but had something dangerous swimming underneath. That's when Nate made a quiet call to Dr. Wyatt Keene, the old veterinarian who had helped their ranch since Nate was a kid. Dr. Keene was well into his 60s now. His hair was silver and his voice slow and steady like a man who didn't waste words. He arrived early one July morning with his dusty pickup and his familiar black medical bag. "I came as soon as I could," he said, shaking Nate's hand. "You said it was about the bull?" Nate nodded, glancing toward the pen. "Bruno, he's different." Dr. Keene stepped to the fence and stood silently, watching Bruno from a distance. The bull was in his usual spot, facing the farmhouse, body still, ears twitching only slightly. "I've seen bulls stand like that," the vet said, finally. "But not for long. Not unless they're planning something." Nate blinked. "Planning something?" Dr. Keene nodded. "Bulls don't hold grudges like people do, but they don't forget either. Pain leaves a memory, and this one's been through more than most animals ever should." Just then, Elroy came stomping out of the house, frowning when he saw the vet. "What are you doing here, Keene?" Elroy asked. "Nobody called for a checkup." "I did," Nate said, his voice quiet but steady. "I thought it was time someone took a good look at Bruno." Elroy rolled his eyes. "He's fine, strong as ever. Just needs to keep learning who's boss." Dr. Keene didn't answer right away. He walked slowly around the pen, watching Bruno's eyes the entire time. The bull never looked away, not once. His head shifted slightly to keep the vet in view, but his focus never left Elroy. "You see that?" Dr. Keene said, pointing. Elroy shrugged. "He's just stubborn." "No," the vet replied. "He's watching you. That's not stubborn, that's memory, that's awareness." Bruno snorted softly and shifted his weight, the ground beneath him crunching under his hooves. The sound was enough to make one of the ranch hands flinch. "You're creating a powder keg," Dr. Keene said seriously. "He's not just injured, he's thinking. You keep pushing him, and one day he's not going to take it anymore." Elroy crossed his arms, irritated. "Don't tell me how to run my ranch. That animal is mine, and I'll deal with him as I see fit." Dr. Keene didn't back down. "He's not a machine, Elroy. He's not just reacting anymore. He's responding. You've turned him into something dangerous." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of flies and the quiet clink of the windmill in the distance. "I've known you a long time," Dr. Keene said, gentler now. You weren't always like this. Elroy looked away, jaw tight. The world's changed, Wyatt. I did what I had to. Maybe, the vet replied. But if you don't stop, one day soon that bull is going to do what he has to. Nate watched the exchange silently. Deep down, he knew Dr. Keene was right. Bruno wasn't broken. He was waiting. And if his father couldn't see it, then something terrible was going to happen. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long orange shadows across the fields, Bruno didn't lie down like usual. He stood near the gate, facing the house, unmoving. From the front porch, Elroy sat in his chair sipping whiskey and muttering about soft-hearted fools, but his eyes kept drifting toward the pen. Bruno never blinked. Inside the barn, the ranch hands refused to work near the fence after dark. It's those eyes, one of them whispered to Nate. It's like he's not even an animal anymore. Nate stood at the barn door staring out at the pen. He couldn't explain it, but he felt it too. Bruno wasn't just a bull. He was a memory with horns, a silence that remembered, and that silence was almost done waiting. Morning broke over the Matson ranch with an eerie stillness. The birds didn't sing. The wind didn't move. Even the trees stood quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Elroy Matson stepped out of the house, whip in hand as usual. He took his time crossing the yard, boots crunching over dry dirt. His shoulders were stiff and his face wore the same sour scowl it always did when he looked toward the corral. Bruno was already standing at the center of the pen. That was the first strange thing. He never stood there. For 7 years, the bull had always stayed in the far corner, as far from Elroy as possible. But today, he was waiting in the middle. Still, calm, blocking the gate. Elroy slowed slightly as he reached the fence. Well, well, he muttered. Look who finally decided to act tough. Bruno didn't move. His dark eyes locked on Elroy's, face with a steady gaze. His breathing was deep even. There was no fear in him. No panic. Just focus. Nate stood nearby, a few feet from the barn, holding a shovel. He hadn't planned to stay and watch, but something had told him to keep an eye on things today. Something in his gut felt wrong. Elroy stepped into the corral. Dust kicked up behind him as he walked toward the bull, coiling the whip slowly in one hand. All right, beast, he said, voice low and cold. Let's see if you still need your daily lesson. He lifted the whip. That's when it happened. Bruno's head dipped just slightly. His front leg shifted forward. His weight rolled into a low, solid stance that any experienced rancher would have recognized. Not as a sign of defense, but attack. For a second, the world held still. Then Bruno charged. It was like a thunderclap exploding into motion. 2,000. Pounds of raw muscle and memory surged forward, hooves thudding hard against the ground. Dust exploded behind him. His horns aimed like daggers. His eyes were locked on one man, Elroy. He barely had time to gasp. The bull hit him full force in the chest, lifting him clear off the ground and throwing him like a rag doll across the corral. His body crashed into the wooden fence with a loud crack. The whip flew from his hand and landed uselessly in the dirt. From the barn, Nate screamed. Dad! He dropped the shovel and ran toward the pen, but something told him not to climb in. Not yet. Elroy groaned and rolled onto his side, coughing, clutching his ribs. His hat was gone and blood was trickling from a cut above his eye. You stupid animal, he wheezed. Bruno didn't back off. He stepped closer, hooves shaking the ground. His muscles rippled beneath his dark coat, every step slow, full of purpose. This wasn't wild rage. This was something colder. Smarter. Elroy crawled toward the fence, dragging himself through the dirt. Help me, he shouted, voice high with panic. Somebody, get the gun. Get the rifle. But no one moved. The ranch hand stood frozen near the barn, eyes wide. They'd seen Bruno's charge. They'd heard the sound of the impact, and deep down they all knew this moment had been coming. Elroy reached the bottom of the fence and tried to climb, but his arm gave out, pain flashing through his body. He managed to get one leg up, dragging himself halfway to safety. Bruno lowered his head again. With terrifying speed, he launched forward a second time. His shoulder slammed into Elroy's back, pinning him hard against the wooden rails. The fence cracked under the pressure. Elroy cried out in pain as the air was knocked from his lungs. Nate finally reached the edge of the pen. "Stop," he shouted. "Bruno, stop." And then, silence. The bull stepped back. His chest heaved with each breath, nostrils flaring. But he didn't attack again. Elroy lay crumpled against the broken fence, moaning weakly. He looked up at Bruno with fear in his eyes, real, deep fear. Not anger, not pride, just the helplessness of a man who no longer had control. "Shoot him," he whispered. "Please, he'll kill me." But Nate didn't move. He looked into Bruno's eyes, and what he saw made him pause. Bruno wasn't wild. He wasn't angry anymore. He had done what he needed to do. His eyes held no madness, only the calm of something finished. A storm that had passed. Dr. Keene arrived moments later, rushing to the fence with his medical bag. He took one look at Elroy and then turned to the bull, who stood quietly in the center of the pen. The vet nodded once. "He's done." Weeks passed after the day Bruno charged, but the memory of it stayed with everyone on the ranch. It was the kind of moment that changed things, not just in the body, but in the heart. Elroy Madsen lay in bed, his ribs tightly wrapped and one arm resting in a sling. Bruises covered his chest and back, but none of them hurt as much as the silence that filled the house now. For years, Elroy had run the ranch with a loud voice and a hard hand. Now he only had his thoughts. From his bedroom window, he watched the fields every morning. He saw the workers moving differently, slower, calmer, even happier. And right in the middle of it all was Nate, his son, leading with quiet strength. There were no whips, no shouting, no fear, just work, just care. Bruno, too, had changed. Nate had moved him to a large pasture behind the barn where the grass was thick and green. A small shelter gave the bull shade and comfort, and for the first time in years, Bruno had space to breathe, to move, and to rest. But he didn't rest right away. The first few days, he simply stood near the edge of the fence, watching the house. Always watching. Nate visited him every morning, not with a whip, but with a bucket of grain and a quiet voice. At first, Bruno kept his distance, but after a few days, he stepped forward, slow and cautious, and accepted the food. There was no rush, no force, just respect. "You're making him soft," Elroy grumbled one day when Nate brought him lunch. "He's dangerous. You forget that too easy." Nate looked at his father, then out the window. "He's not dangerous because of who he is," he said softly. "He was dangerous because of what you turned him into." Elroy scowled. "He almost killed me." "After 7 years of pain, Dad," Nate said. "He didn't try to kill you, he stopped. He could have finished it, but he didn't. That tells me he's more human than we gave him credit for." Elroy didn't answer. He stared out the window in silence. The days turned into weeks. The ranch changed more than anyone thought possible. The cattle, once jumpy and stressed, now moved calmly through the fields. The hands no longer feared the barn or the bull. And for the first time in a long time, the ranch started to turn a profit again. Bruno remained the heart of it all. Strong, calm, and quiet. His coat had grown darker and healthier. His eyes, once filled with fury, now held something softer. Still cautious, still aware, but not angry. One clear afternoon, Elroy stood at the fence with Nate by his side. He leaned heavily on a walking cane, his body still healing, his pride still bruised. Bruno stood at the far end of the pasture, his massive head raised as he watched the two men. Elroy took a slow breath. "He remembers." "Yeah," Nate said. "But he's not holding on to it." They stood there for a while. Then, without speaking, Elroy reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a wooden plaque, carved by hand. The letters were rough, but clear. "Bruno, Never. Broken. Nate took it, his eyebrows raised. I thought maybe we'd hang it by the pasture, Elroy said, his voice low. He earned it. Nate nodded and quietly nailed the sign to the fence. Bruno watched, calm and steady. Dr. Keene stopped by that evening. He walked the ranch with a quiet smile, nodding at the improvements. When he reached the pasture, he stood at the fence beside Elroy. I've been treating animals for 40 years, the vet said, but I've never seen a bull like him. He's not the same, Elroy admitted. No, Dr. Keene said. But maybe neither are you. Elroy looked out at Bruno, who stood near the fence now. Close, but not too close. I don't expect him to forgive me, Elroy said. But I'm trying to be someone he doesn't have to fear anymore. That's a start, the vet replied. As the sun dipped low, turning the sky gold and pink, Bruno stepped forward and stopped just a few feet from the fence. Elroy slowly extended his hand, not close enough to touch, just enough to show he wasn't a threat. Bruno stared at the hand for a moment. Then, with quiet dignity, he turned and walked back into the pasture. Not in fear, not in anger, just as a creature who had finally been seen, and maybe, in his own way, forgiven. The Madsen Ranch would never be the same, not because of what was lost, but because of what was finally learned. That true strength doesn't come from control or pain. It comes from respect, patience, and the courage to change. And Bruno, the bull who never spoke a word, had taught them all a lesson no one would forget.